In the summer of 2013, archaeologist Claude Dumais-Serhal was excavating a burial site beneath the streets of modern Sidon, a coastal city in southern Lebanon. Her team had been working the site for over a decade. They were looking for the ancient city that history books called one of the greatest of the ancient world. A city so powerful, it gave its name to an entire civilization. They found it, and buried within it, in graves that had not been opened in roughly 3,700 years, they found the people. 5 individuals, preserved well enough that their teeth still held usable genetic material. Their bones were taken to a laboratory at the Wellcome Sanger Institute in Cambridge, England. The DNA that came out of those teeth would produce a result that scientists described as striking, that journalists described as controversial, and that anyone who had ever read the Old Testament would describe as something considerably more unsettling than either of those words. Because those 5 people from ancient Sidon should not have had living descendants. According to one of the most widely read documents in human history, their entire civilization had been commanded by God to be completely and utterly destroyed. The Canaanites are one of the most mentioned and least understood peoples in all of ancient history. Their name appears in the Bible more than 150 times. They appear in the book of Genesis as the descendants of Canaan, the grandson of Noah, cursed by his grandfather, for reasons the text describes obliquely and scholars have argued about for centuries. They appear in Exodus as the original inhabitants of the land promised to the Israelites, the people who needed to be removed for the promise to be fulfilled. They appear in Deuteronomy in language that is not ambiguous. You shall not leave alive anything that breathes. You shall utterly destroy them, the Hittites and the Amorites, the Canaanites and the Perizzites, the Hivites and the Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you. The book of Joshua describes the fulfillment of that command in systematic detail. Jericho, Ai, Makkedah, Libnah, Lachish, Eglon, Hebron, Debir, city after city. The text records the same outcome. He left no survivor. He utterly destroyed all who breathed. For 3,000 years, that narrative sat at the foundation of a religious tradition followed by billions of people. And for most of those 3,000 years, there was no scientific method available to verify or challenge it. That changed in 2017. And the answer that came back from those 5 sets of teeth in Sidon was not what anyone had predicted, including the scientists who extracted it. Before the DNA, the evidence was already complicated. Not because the biblical account seemed false on its face, but because the Bible itself seemed unsure about it. The book of Judges, written later than Joshua, describes the Canaanites as very much still present in the land after the conquest was supposedly complete. The Israelites lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. They took their daughters in marriage and gave their own daughters to their sons and served their gods. This is not the description of a people who were utterly destroyed. This is the description of a people who were absorbed, who married into the conquering population, who continued their religious practices inside the communities that had supposedly replaced them. The contradiction sits in the same text. Historians and theologians had proposed various explanations. The conquest was gradual, not immediate. The command was theological rather than literal. The texts were written by different authors with different traditions and combined without full harmonization. Each explanation had some merit. None was definitive. The DNA was definitive. To understand what the DNA found, it helps to understand what the Canaanites actually were before the biblical narrative reduced them to a category of people who needed to be removed. The Canaanites occupied a strip of land along the eastern Mediterranean coast that today encompasses Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, coastal Syria, and parts of Jordan. They had been there in recognizable cultural form since approximately 3,500 BCE, which makes their civilization older than the Old Kingdom of Egypt and older than the earliest Mesopotamian city-states. They were not nomads. They built cities, fortified and sophisticated, connected by trade routes that ran from the Nile Delta to the Euphrates. Sidon was one of their oldest and greatest cities. Tyre was another. built on a small island just off the coast in a feat of engineering that confounded their neighbors and eventually forced even Alexander the Great to build a causeway across the sea to capture it. Their pottery was produced at an industrial scale and exported across the entire eastern Mediterranean. Their timber, the famous cedars of Lebanon that towered over the coastal mountains, was shipped to Egypt where trees of that size did not grow. The Egyptians paid for it in gold and linen. The Canaanites built the ships that carried the trade. What they built that mattered most, however, was invisible. Around 1050 BCE, the Canaanites of the Phoenician coast developed a writing system that did something no writing system before it had done. It represented not syllables or whole words, but individual sounds. 22 consonants, arranged in a fixed order, capable of spelling any word in any language that used those sounds. It was the world's first alphabet. Every alphabet now used on Earth descends directly from that Canaanite invention. The Hebrew letters used to write the Torah came from it. The Greek letters used to write the New Testament came from it. The Latin letters used to write every language in the Western world came from it. The Arabic alphabet came from it. The Cyrillic alphabet used across Russia and Eastern Europe came from it. The word you are reading at this moment was built from sounds first organized by the people the Bible says were commanded to be utterly destroyed. That is not a footnote. That is a consequence that runs through the entire length of recorded human thought. They were also, according to their neighbors, a people whose religion required them to burn their children alive. The practice, described in Phoenician and Canaanite religious texts and partially confirmed by archaeological sites in North Africa and Sardinia, was called the Tophet. Infants and young children were sacrificed to the gods, Baal and Molech, in dedicated ritual spaces. The bones were collected and buried in urns. The biblical prophets condemned it in language that was unambiguous. They built the high places of Baal to burn their sons in the fire, as burnt offerings to Baal. The practice has been debated by modern scholars, some of whom argue the Tophets represented burial of children who died naturally rather than ritual killing. Others argue the evidence for deliberate sacrifice is clear. What is not in debate is that the Canaanites practiced a form of religion that their Israelite neighbors found not merely foreign, but monstrous, and that this provided the theological framework within which the commands of extermination made internal sense. You were not asked to destroy innocent people. You were asked to end a system of worship that the God of Israel had declared incompatible with the world he was building. That theological framing is 3,000 years old. The DNA study published in July 2017 Inches, the American Journal of Human Genetics, is 7 years old. The results of the two do not sit comfortably together. Mark Haber, a population geneticist at the Wellcome Sanger Institute, led a team of researchers who analyzed the genomes of the 5 ancient Canaanite individuals excavated from Sidon. The individuals dated to approximately 1,700 BCE, the Middle Bronze Age, a period when Canaanite civilization was at a peak of cultural and commercial power. Their DNA was then compared against the genomes of 99 people from present-day Lebanon, sampled with care to represent the full regional diversity of the modern Lebanese population. The comparison produced a number that Haber's team described in careful scientific language. It was striking. 93% of the ancestry of modern Lebanese people derives directly from the ancient Canaanites. The remaining 7% arrived later, from populations associated with the Eurasian steppe, introduced into the gene pool during the Bronze Age and the centuries that followed. But the core of what makes a Lebanese person genetically Lebanese was already present in those 5 individuals from Sidon in 1700 BCE, and it has remained there ever since. Through the rise and fall of the Phoenician city-states, through the Assyrian conquest that scattered 10 tribes of Israel, through Alexander's campaigns, through Roman rule, through the Byzantine period, through the Arab conquest of the 7th century CE, through the Crusades, through the Ottoman Empire, through the creation of the modern Lebanese state, through every political and military upheaval that transformed this stretch of coastline over the course of 3.5 millennia, the Canaanite genetic signature did not disappear. It persisted through all of it, as continuous and unbroken as the Mediterranean coastline itself. The methodology that produced this finding is worth understanding because it is the same methodology that has been reshaping the ancient world across a dozen simultaneous investigations. Ancient DNA degrades rapidly under most burial conditions. Heat, moisture, and microbial activity destroy it. What makes the Sidon teeth usable after nearly 4,000 years is a combination of factors that the Lebanese coastal environment happened to provide. The climate is dry enough that biological degradation was slowed. The teeth themselves are dense enamel shells that protect the DNA inside longer than any other part of the skeleton. And the specific chemical conditions of the Sidon burial site preserved organic material in a way that allowed Haber's team to extract sequences long enough to be meaningful. From those sequences, they could identify haplogroups, the inherited genetic markers that geneticists use to track population movements across time. They could measure the proportional contribution of different ancestral populations to the modern genome. And they could determine, with a precision that was simply not available before ancient DNA methodology existed, how much of a modern population's ancestry traces to any specific ancient group. 93% is not a marginal finding. It is not within the range of uncertainty. It is a number that says, clearly and without ambiguity, that the people of ancient Canaan were not destroyed. They were not removed. They were not replaced. They continue to live in the same cities where their ancestors had always lived, under successive waves of political and military rulers, absorbing small amounts of outside genetic material at the margins, but remaining, at their core, what they had always been. The Assyrians conquered the northern Levant in the 8th century BCE and deported populations across their empire. They did not replace the people already there. The Babylonians came after them, then the Persians, then the Greeks, then the Romans. Each conquest brought new administrators, soldiers, and settlers. None of them rewrote the genetic landscape of the coastal Levant. The Canaanites were still there when the Romans arrived. They are still there now. Haber's study did not stop at Lebanon. The comparison population they used was modern Lebanese because Lebanon sits geographically at the heart of ancient Canaan. And the modern Lebanese population had the clearest and most direct line of descent from the ancient Canaanites that the data could establish. But the Canaanite genetic signature does not stop at the Lebanese border. Modern Palestinians carry it. Modern Syrians carry it. Modern Israelis of Middle Eastern descent carry it. Modern Jordanians carry it. The populations that live today in the territories the book of Joshua describes as Canaanite territory are, in measurable biological terms, significantly Canaanite. The conquest, if it happened in the form the text describes, did not produce the genetic outcome that full extermination would require. Populations do not disappear from the archaeological and genetic record because a military force sweeps through. They can be killed in large numbers, enslaved, displaced, their cities burned, and their leadership eliminated. But the ordinary people, the farmers and potters and weavers who made up the mass of any ancient population, they tend to survive. They adapt to new rulers. They pay new taxes and bow to new gods and learn new languages while speaking the old one at home. And they have children who carry their genetics forward into the next generation and the generation after that for 3,000 years. The study produced one reaction from the scientific community and a different one from the broader public. Within ancient DNA research, the findings fit cleanly into a pattern that had been emerging for years. Population replacement events were rarer than the political and military history of the ancient world suggested. Conquest changed governance and culture. It rarely changed the fundamental genetic composition of the people being governed. The same pattern appears in the genetics of Bronze Age Europe, where Indo-European migrations reshaped language and culture, but did not eliminate the farming populations already present. It appears in the genetics of post-Roman Britain, where the Anglo-Saxon migrations changed the cultural landscape without replacing the Romano-British population at the level the historical narrative had implied. The Canaanite study was another data point in a pattern that was becoming clear. The people we were told disappeared usually did not disappear. They became someone else's ancestors. The public reaction was more complicated. The American Schools of Oriental Research, a scholarly organization whose work is closely tied to biblical archaeology, initially declined to publicize Haber's study. They released a statement clarifying their position only after the findings became widely reported. Some religious scholars argued that the study did not disprove the biblical account of the conquest, only that the conquest was incomplete, which the Bible itself concedes in certain passages. Others argued that the numbers confirmed what careful readers of the text had always known, that the destruction described in Joshua was theological language rather than literal history, a claim of divine authority over territory rather than a factual account of population elimination. A smaller number rejected the DNA evidence entirely, arguing that the methodology was flawed or the comparisons invalid. The methodology has since been replicated and expanded by subsequent studies, and the core finding has held. What the DNA does not resolve is the historical question of what actually happened between the Israelite migration into Canaan and the period when the texts describing that migration were written. The books of Joshua and Deuteronomy were composed in their final form during the 7th century BCE, roughly 500 years after the events they describe. They were written during a period of intense political and religious reform under the Judean king Josiah, who had strong reasons to emphasize the absolute authority of the Israelite God and the absolute otherness of Canaanite religious practice. The level of destruction described in those texts may reflect political theology as much as historical memory. The DNA cannot tell us what people believed or intended. It can tell us what happened to the population. And what happened to the population is that it continued. The Canaanites of Sidon became the Phoenicians of the Iron Age. The distinction is partly linguistic and partly historical. After the Bronze Age collapse of around 1200 BCE, the great Canaanite city-states of the inland regions largely disappeared, destroyed by the same wave of disruption that toppled the Hittites and destabilized Egypt. But the coastal cities, Sidon and Tyre in particular, survived. And in the centuries that followed, the people of those cities became the greatest maritime traders the ancient world had ever seen. They established colonies from one end of the Mediterranean to the other. Carthage, which would one day challenge Rome for dominance of the Western world, was a Phoenician colony founded by settlers from Tyre in the 9th century BCE. The Phoenician alphabetic tradition, already described, became the foundation on which every subsequent literate civilization in the Western world was built. The Phoenicians carried their genes into every colony they established, mixed them with local populations, and spread the Canaanite genetic signature from Spain to Cyprus to North Africa to Sicily. A 2008 study by the National Geographic Society's Genographic Project estimated that roughly 1 in 17 men living in the Mediterranean region today carries the Y chromosome marker most closely associated with ancient Phoenician expansion, 1 in 17. In a region of several hundred million people, that is tens of millions of individuals, carrying a direct paternal line back to the civilization the Bible commanded to be destroyed. The 5 individuals excavated from Sidon by Claude Dumais-Serhal's team are not anomalies. They are representatives of a continuity that runs from the middle of the 2nd millennium BCE to the present day, unbroken by conquest, by religious transformation, by the rise and fall of every empire that has passed through the Levant. Since the pharaohs were building pyramids, they spoke a language that is the direct ancestor of Hebrew. They wrote with an alphabet that is the direct ancestor of every alphabet now in use on Earth. They traded with Egypt and Cyprus and the Aegean. They buried their dead with pottery and jewelry and offerings that archaeologists can now hold in their hands. They left DNA in their teeth that scientists can now read. And when that DNA was compared against the people who live today in the same coastal strip where the ancient Canaanites built their cities, the result was not what the 3,000-year-old narrative had prepared anyone to expect. The mystery the biblical text seemed to have resolved, the mystery of what happened to the Canaanites, turned out not to have been resolved at all. It had simply been declared resolved by a text composed 5 centuries after the fact, in service of a theological argument that required the Canaanites to have been eliminated. The DNA says something different. It says they were never eliminated. It says the people who live today in Lebanon and in Israel and in Palestine and in Syria and in Jordan carry their genetics in measurable, undeniable proportion. It says the civilization that invented the alphabet, that built Sidon and Tyre, that spread trade across the ancient Mediterranean, that worshipped Baal on the high places, and burned incense to Asherah under every green tree, did not end. It continued. It became the modern populations of the Levant, carrying the genetics of ancient Canaan forward through every century that separated them from those 5 individuals in the ground beneath the streets of Sidon. The teeth carried the information. The DNA read it. And the answer they produced is one that 3,000 years of religious tradition had said was impossible. The Canaanites are still here.